Remember, history, we know, is always written by the victor. But in order to be true history, in order to be factual, in order to be recording events as they took place, Carr tells us that what the historian, what the writer of history requires is an imaginative understanding. The British historian should be able to see what the Soviets feel about a particular event, about a particular incident, about a particular treaty, about a particular discussion, and see it also from the Soviets' point of view before he records it as history. And to this, Carr gives the term imaginative understanding. The next point that Carr makes is history is always viewing of the past through the present. Why? As I mentioned earlier, depending on whether you are living in the Elizabethan age, the Restoration age, the Neoclassical age, the Romantic age, or the Victorian age, or the 21st century, how you look at a particular event is going to matter, is going to change. Is it possible then to have a neutral language? All linguists, all theories of language tell us that there's nothing where a word is not loaded with some positive or negative meaning. My dear students, you and me, living in a democratic free India, probably use words like democracy with a particular meaning. But think of a dictatorial regime where the word democracy probably is loaded with negative meaning. Think of words like empire. Think of words like war. Think of words like revolution. These words are always loaded with meaning, and therefore the historian has to be careful to use neutral language. My dear students, we just celebrated Independence Day. Maybe some of you remember your history, Indian history. I remember a few years ago when all our books of history were written by the British. We referred to 1857 as the Sepoy Mutiny. I'm talking to you about the importance of language, the importance of trying to have a neutral language. Because the books were written by the British, it was called the Sepoy Mutiny. We gradually changed the word and began to call it the revolt. Later, we thought, no, we need a better word, and therefore we called it the First War of Independence. I'm giving you a very simple example. It's not from Thomas Carr. But in order to make the point clear, because if I relate it to the surroundings in which we live, to the country in which we live, I'm sure it'll become clearer how when a historian writes, when he records the events of the past, unless he uses a neutral language, the history might not be factual. The history might be a power play. And therefore, we must remember that when he is viewing the events of the past, the importance of a neutral language. When we look at history, there is always this question of dichotomy. What is the historian recording? Is the historian recording a fact, or is he recording his interpretation? I just gave you the example of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. The fact is that in a particular year, Julius Caesar, with a certain number of soldiers on a particular day, at a particular moment, maybe the time is recorded, he crossed the Rubicon. This is the fact. But what does the historian do? He interprets it. Therefore, you have this constant dichotomy between whether it's a fact or whether it's an interpretation. Let me say that again. The time is recorded, is noted. The place is noted. But then, what about the interpretation? How important is the crossing of the Rubicon? That is decided by the historian. Another point that is often made is that in the recording of history, there is a distinction, a dichotomy between the particular and the general. A historian is probably recording the events of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or to put it a little differently, the Industrial Revolution. There might be specific revolutions, but in recording the events, in interpreting the facts, he probably comes to certain general conclusions. Why revolutions take place? What is the process of revolution? What is the end of revolution? What are the good things that happen in a revolution? What are the bad things that happen in a revolution? So what is the historian doing? He has a particular revolution, but from that he moves on to the general. There is also the question of the dichotomy between the empirical and the theoretical. There is also the question of the dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. I've talked about it earlier also when we were talking about literature, when we started talking about what is history, and therefore I shall not repeat the point. Let us draw our conclusions of this essay. I'm talking about the essay by Thomas Carr, which is the historian and his facts. And therefore, what is the conclusion that we need to draw? History is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. An unending dialogue, my dear students, is an important phrase, because as long as history is being written, it will change. The dialogue will change. Because the past may remain the same, but the present will change depending on which moment the history is. And therefore, the conclusion that Thomas Carr arrives at is, the historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without the historian are dead and meaningless. Let me repeat that for you. The historian without his facts is rootless and futile. The facts without their historian are dead and meaningless. And that is why Carr concludes this essay with, history is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. In this lecture, my dear students, I'm trying to deal with two essays of Thomas Carr. The second essay is called History, Science and Morality. Having looked at the historian and his facts, we are now moving on to the question as to whether history is a science. Is history a science? When we ask ourselves this question, some of you might immediately come up with the answer, no, it's not a pure science, but it is a social science. What do we mean by science? What are the sciences? And what is it that is common to all the sciences? Then maybe you would say that when we talk of something as being science, we say that it is possible to verify, it is possible to modify, and it is possible to refute. All science, probably, in order to propound a theory, begin with a hypothesis, right? Now, the hypothesis has to be verified, if necessary, modified. And if we find that it doesn't work, it's not true, maybe the hypothesis was wrong, then what we need to do is to refute it. And it is argued that history cannot be a science. But you know something very interesting? In many European languages, the word history, in the particular language, there is the inclusion of the idea of science. Strangely, in English, history does not have an inclusion of a word science in it. I was just telling you about the importance of hypothesis in sciences. But let me tell you, even in history, hypothesis is important. For example, very often we divide history into different periods. You know, these periods are only for convenience. It's not as if it's fixed. It makes it convenient for us to look at history by dividing India, the Indian history, into the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period. Then when you look into the ancient period, you've got the different dynasties which ruled. Then when you look at the dynasties, you've got the different kings who ruled. In the same way, you could do to the medieval period, you could do to British India, or to the modern period. What I'm drawing your attention to is, it is wrong to say that in history there is no hypothesis. In history also there is hypothesis. And where there is hypothesis, there should be the possibility of verification. There are some writers, there are some thinkers, according to Carr, who object to calling history a science because of certain reasons. Let's look at those reasons. 1. History deals with unique and the science with general. The first objection, according to these writers, is that history deals with the unique and science with the general. In this essay, History, Science and Morality, God looks at each one of these objections and gives us answers why these objections are not true. He attempts in a very detailed way to give us answers to each one of these objections and to refute them in a very, very scientific way. He says the first objection is that history deals with the unique and science with the general. He says no. Why? Because no two historical events, incidents are identical. And therefore, what happens is everything is moving gradually towards the general. It's not unique, but moving towards the general. Looking at a series of events or similar events. Let us look at wars. Let us look at battles. What the historian does is comes to certain conclusions about battles, about wars. The second objection is that history teaches no lessons. He refutes that argument too by telling us that it is unfair to have such an objection towards history, because he says every generalization, he relates it to the first objection. He says history deals with the general, and from that he comes to the conclusion that there are many lessons of history. When we look at ancient Greece and we look at ancient Rome, we know that there were many lessons that one civilization learned from the other. He says, and therefore it is wrong to say, he refutes the argument that history teaches no lessons. The third objection is that history is unable to predict. Science can predict that because of the law of gravity, we are told that the apple will fall. God gives us a beautiful example. Yes, the apple should fall because of the law of gravity. But science does not tell us that if I hold a pail, a basket, in front of, below the falling apple, the apple is not going to reach the ground. So has science been able to predict that a particular apple will not fall down? He talks about the optical rays, and he says we know that the optical rays travel in a straight line. But something could come in its way, something could stand in the way, something could prove an obstacle by which the light cannot travel in a straight line. Does science predict this? He says in the same way, history also can predict. That if you have these things, if these incidents take place, if the people are unhappy, if this happens, then a revolution is likely to take place. If a king goes into particular battle because of these circumstances, he is likely to fail. So he says history also can predict. The next point that people say about history, that history is subjective and science is objective. Carr raises a question about the validity of such an objection, and he says, no, there is a principle of uncertainty or indeterminacy, and he goes on to say that there is a dichotomy between the known subject and the object that you want to know. This was a dichotomy that was accepted earlier. But he says now, in the 20th century and in the 21st century, we do not place the subject and the object totally being unrelated. We have to accept that the subject and the object are interrelated. This is true of science. This is true as much of history. He also says that it is argued that history involves religion and morality and science does not. And therefore, history cannot be a science. Carr argues that just because you are an astronomer, it does not mean that you should not believe that God created the universe. Just because you are a historian, you do not have to refute, you do not have to question the existence of God. Fine. He says just like an astronomer who believes in God does not believe that the movement, the orbit of planets can be changed. In the same way, the historian does not believe that events took place because of particular reasons that are attributed to a power above us. So he refutes that argument also, that history is different from science because history involves religion, whereas science does not. In this way, Carr refutes all the arguments and then talks about the historian versus the moralist. Is a historian a moralist? And are they doing the same thing? He says no. The historian is a historian, and his standpoints are not identical with the moralist. And the argument that he gives for this is that the historian has no right to pass judgment on private lives. Yes, the historian, in the writing of history, does pass judgment on events, on institutions, and on policies. But nowhere does he pass a moral judgment on the private lives of those individuals who were involved in these events, these institutions, and these policies. And that is why he concludes that the historian is not a judge. The historian is not a judge. A moralist can be a judge. So in this essay, which is beautifully titled History, Science and Morality, Carr tells us that the historian is not a judge, still less a hanging judge. Remember, what the historian is attempting to do, my dear students, is very different from what the moralist is attempting to do. And therefore, the historian is not a judge, still less a hanging judge. I think we have looked at three essays which were tough, which were difficult, which need a lot of concentration, which need to be read in great depth before we can understand it. But in this new syllabus that we are looking at, my dear students, there is something which is also of great interest because it's great fun, because it's about the medieval romance. I began my lecture today by first attempting to define what is literature. We moved on to history and facts. From history and facts, we moved on to history, science and morality. And in the next few minutes, I would like to very quickly talk about medieval romance. The concept of romance has to be understood only when we can understand first the concept of an epic. An epic, my dear students, in Gujarat